Hi everybody, welcome to another edition of Sun Dragon Tips and Tricks. Today we are going to do, hi, I'm Rebecca. I'm the owner of Sun Dragon Art and Fiber in downtown Brevard, North Carolina. Coming to you today from my house, as always, for our tips and tricks. It's a cold, blustery day in December right now. So this week, we are entering into week 3 of Brioche in the Round. We did our setup row. We did our first brioche purl row, which might feel a little out of order if you're thinking, well, knit and then purl. But we're going to get to the knit row today. It's because our setup row was a knit row. Remember, brioche is a fun, interlacing, funky thing. If you're going to do it with 2 colors, I really do recommend learning in the round like we are doing first. We're going in a big loop. This could make a cowl when we're done. And what is cool about it is once you get going, 1 color knits and 1 color purls. You end up with like a knit 1, purl 1 ribbing, but 1 color is doing the knitting and slipping and wrapping other stitches, and the other color is doing the purling. So we did a purl row last week. We're going to do a knit row this week, a full-fledged brioche knit row, which is similar but different than our setup row, because now we have all our wraps in place, so things just become a little tweaked. We're going to go over one of the things when you're switching between a knit and a purl row that can throw people off and make it look weird. We're going to try to catch that right now. And then next week, after we learn the brioche knit row, next week we're going to review everything, and we're going to talk about how you can recognize when it's going right and what to do if you see some weirdnesses that are going wrong. Now, you know I like to draw everything out. We're going to do the brioche knit row. And then next week, I'm not sure what I'll be able to draw out or what will be better to draw out. So if you have any recommendations, it means there may not be as many words next week on the whiteboard. There may be more pictures. However, let's take a look at this, all right? Let's get to it. All right, so brioche in the round, part C. It's our knit row with the first color. Remember that the purl row does the second color. We're focusing on the knit row today. As I mentioned before, this is going to be very similar to our setup row, but we have the 2 colors involved now instead of just 1. So what I've done here is I want to review all of the brioche guidelines, things that will keep you on track no matter what, and then we'll talk about knitting. So some of this is review from last week. So if you haven't watched last week's video, this might catch you up. I still recommend watching last week's video. So here are the ground rules for 2 color brioche. 2 color brioche in the round. Every row is going to have a sequence, one then the other, of single stitches and slip stitches with wraps, both before you do them and then after. They will shift back and forth. But every time you should see single stitch, stitch with a wrap, single stitch, stitch with a wrap. Whether it's a knit or purl is not important right now. If you don't see that, if you see single stitches in a row, something went wonky. If you see every stitch wrapped in a row, something went wonky. It should always be single stitch, stitch with a wrap. Single stitch, stitch with a wrap. Okay? The working yarn, whichever color you're working with, the working yarn should always be in front before you slip a stitch. Always be in front. On some rows, it's already there. On other rows, you need to move it. But really keep that in mind. Anytime you slip a stitch, check, is my yarn in front? If not, get it there. We'll talk about that over on the other side. Stitches that you slip are always slipped purl-wise. When you do slip a stitch, slipping it purl-wise, which means going straight. If this is our stitch that is sitting on a needle, you're going straight in. You're not coming around from any other angle. You're sticking your needle straight in to move it over. When you have 2 colors, As I mentioned up top, but I'm reiterating it here, with two colors, let's highlight this and bring it out. I should say with two colors in the round. One color knits and one color purls. It's different when you're working flat. It depends on what row you're on, and that adds complication, and that's something we will address in the next unit of this. So when two colors are going in the round, one color knits, one color purls. It's how you can keep it straight. Regardless, once you have the two colors going, some of these rules will apply to in the round and flat. Not to be confusing at all. Once you have two colors, you're always slipping single stitches of the color you are not working with. So if I'm working with color A, the stitches I'm slipping should be color B. And if they're not, hang on, something went weird, something went sideways. If I'm working with color B, my slip stitches should be color A. Another thing to keep in mind to keep you on track, the wrap always goes around a slip stitch of the other color. The wrap will be your working yarn, and when that goes over a slip stitch, so they should alternate. The stitch and its wrap should always be different colors. That's my way of summing that up. A stitch and its wrap should always be different colors. So another thing to help you stay on track, your brioche knits, which are combining a stitch and its wrap, knitting that together, and your brioche purls, which are combining a stitch and its wrap together, either knitwise or purlwise, they should combine two strands of different colors. If they don't, something went wonky. It's my favorite word, my word of the day. Something's weird, something's wonky. Now, the other thing to keep in mind as you're checking for that is be sure what you're working is a stitch and a wrap, not just strands of different colors, because this could throw you off if you say, okay, well, I just need color A and color B, and if you grab two stitches next to each other that are color A and color B and not a stitch and its wrap, you're combining two stitches rather than knitting or purling your brioche wraps together, and you'll end up with the wrong number of stitches. This can happen when you forget to wrap on a previous row. If a stitch doesn't have a wrap, you might just look for another color and yank it together, and that's not what we want to happen. You want to think about shapes. A stitch will be straight up and down, a wrap will be slanted over it instead of two straight stitches. If they're different colors, that's fantastic, but if it's not a stitch and its wrap, it's not what you want. We may address this a little bit more next week. So let's talk specifics of a brioche knit row. Remember, for lingo, BRK is the abbreviation often in a pattern for brioche knit, or the abbreviation, the fun word for it is bark. It's where you're knitting a stitch and its wrap together, brioche knit. And BRP, we learned last week, is a brioche purl. It's where you're purling a stitch and its wrap together, or the fun name is a burp. And remember, I said one color is going to knit, one color is going to purl. We did the purl row last week with color B, so we're going to do the knit row this week with color A. This is so I can keep them straight and color things in correctly. Another thing we've introduced you to the past 2 weeks is every row has a mantra, has a repeated phrase. For a knit row, where we're using color A, I've written a couple of different variants here. There's 3 things in each mantra. I'd like you to pick the word or lettering that makes sense to you. So a brioche knit or a bark, a yarn or over or a yarn forward, this one will make sense if you're knitting continental. This one may make more sense if you're knitting English style. Continental is holding the yarn in your left hand. English style is holding the yarn in your right hand. We can address that a little bit when we do it with real yarn. and then slipping a stitch. So again, I just spent a lot of time going over these three things. I like keeping the words as simple as possible. So it's bark, yarn forward, slip. Some people will condense this down even further and they might call this a wrap to get it down to one word. But be careful, you don't want to be wrapping the wrong thing. So bark, yarn forward, I think makes the most sense for me personally when I'm doing it. Bark, yarn forward, slip. Bark, yarn forward, slip. So let's see these in at least drawing action. One thing I want to go over first is when you finish the purl row, let's talk about the transition. Because when you finish the purl row, you may notice that the wrap that was here that you brioche purled, that's the last thing you did on the last lesson. You finish with a brioche purl. Funky thing happens to the yarn. So let's color code this so we can talk about it. First, I'm going to color in the yarn we used last time for the pearls. It wrapped and purled and wrapped. And let's get color A in there, what color A will look like right now. Now here's the crazy thing you may have noticed and go, what am I supposed to do with this? When you finish a brioche purl row. By purling the stitch and its wrap, that last wrap was locked in place by just yarning over to back to the front. And it can fall away and look like both yarns are just hanging down to the right of the last stitch of the row. So we need to prep. We need to prep for this new row. And this is the only time you do this. You're going to take your color A yarn. You're going to go over your color B yarn and between the needles to bring it to the back to knit. This is the only time it goes to the back between the needles. Take color A over color B and set to the back. It's going to wrap around this stitch right here and go to the back to be ready to knit. Because that's what we're doing on this row. We are knitting. That brings us to the first brioche knit or bark. By bringing our yarn to the back, it's ready back there to do what it needs to do. It also may have wrapped, it may look like it's on top or underneath. It's wrapped around this little purl stitch here, which was the end of the row. I've got my marker here indicating the end of the row. This is the stitch in its wrap that we are now brioche knitting together. So when you stick your needle in, you're going to be combining two stitches of alternating colors. And let's just color code what's coming up. So to brioche knit these together, put it in like you're going to knit a stitch. Take your working yarn and wrap around the back needle, pull through. Once you finish your brioche knit, your bark should look like this down here, where we have finished. Usually what will show more is your color A. And your knit stitches will start stacking. So this is what it looks like when you have finished your brioche knit. Yarn's in the back. Second part of the mantra is yarn forward. You need to bring this yarn between the needles to the front. Not wrapping over any of the needles, we're just setting it to the front. Setting your yarn, the yarn front. So bark, yarn to the front, yarn forward. Whatever makes sense for your brain there, tell it that. And now we're going to slip a stitch. Now again, when the yarn's hanging in front, here's what it will look like. Just did my brioche knit right here. Brioche knit, yarn front, and we're slipping a stitch purlwise of the other color. Now here's the cool thing. If we slip this over, if we slip this purlwise over, we're back to the beginning of the mantra. I'm calling this the new one. It's not the first one. From here on out, every time you do a bark or a brioche knit, if you've moved your yarn to the front and slipped your stitch right here, and you're about to brioche knit the stitch and its wrap together, by bringing the yarn from the front over behind the needles and around from the front here, so that's really the track it's going to take. It's going to wrap this stitch because it's in front here. As it goes over the needle, you don't move it to the back again. You just go ahead and knit. It's going to create the wrap when you go ahead and knit. It can be really hard to remember you're only doing 3 things. Try to keep your brain from saying, oh, we were purling and then we're going to knit, so we're going to set our yarn to the back. Nope. Leave it in front, slip your stitch, go ahead and brioche knit. What will end up happening, we will end up with what is down here, with a new series of stitches with the knit V's under them, alternating with slip stitches of the other color with wraps of our knit color. That is how it should look when it's done. So this was a lot to throw at y'all, although if you've been with me from the beginning, this is just a step different from our setup row. But we've got the 3 parts of our mantra. We have A, B, and C, and we're going to keep repeating. Step A is brioche knit. Step B is move your yarn to the front between the needles. Step C is slip purlwise with your yarn in front. And that brings us back to A. Now remember, I don't have it written here, but I have to find a way to add in at the end. We need to remember to perform the final wrap of the last slip stitch ourselves to lock in place. So that's a lot to cram into this whiteboard. That's always been my challenge with brioche, is there's a lot to tell you, and it's hard to boil it down. But essentially, once you get going, A, B, C, A, B, C, bark, yarn forward, slip, bark, yarn forward, slip. At the end of the last slip, you need to take this yarn and physically wrap it around that last slip stitch and leave it in front again. We will see that when we do it with the real yarn. All right, so this is the end of our purl row. Our brioche purl was right here. It may not look like a brioche purl because this wrap popped off and is hanging here. This is what I was showing you in my drawing. Color B, color A. So we need to take color A and just wrap it in front of that stitch and go between the needles. Let me show you that one more time without my hands in the way. We're just going to pick this up. We don't want to twist it with that guy. Lift up, take between the needles, place to the back. it's going to wrap around this last purl stitch a little bit. And since this is our first or second row, this is a little weird right here. Just try to ignore it. Take a look right here. Remember, as you slide things up, things can get jimmy jangled. So just if you need to, sort yourself out. I have a stitch with its wrap, a straight up and down with a diagonal. That's going to be my brioche knit. So I put my needle into both of these strands and I'm knitting them together. So bark, yarn to the front. You don't have to take your hand off of that if you like holding tension, but I'm doing it so you all can see. Single stitch is slipped, never a stitch with its wrap, and it's the other color. This is all good news. Slipping purlwise. Now I'm resisting the urge to place that back to knit. You only place it to the back to knit on that very first stitch. I'm going to come to do a brioche knit, grab my yarn. It's going to create the wrap as I go to brioche knit or bark. Yarn to the front. Yarn should always be in the front before I slip. And here's an example of, it almost looks like a stitch in its wrap of the same color. That means either something went wrong or it's wonky. If I pull this apart, I can see this wrap is actually wrapping this stitch. They just got a little bit, they jumped each other a bit. I got to straighten that out. So again, yarn forward, slip. It's the end of my mantra, but I had to straighten that out. So I'm going to brioche knit the stitch and its wrap together. By doing that, I ended up creating the wrap back here. Yarn always needs to be in front before you slip. So yarn front, and then I can slip. Brioche knit, which will retroactively create a wrap back here. Yarn forward, straighten that out so you've got your single stitch that you're slipping and you're not slipping a wrap. Those are things that can throw off your brioche. Leave that yarn in the front. Brioche knit, yarn to the front before you slip, untangle, and slip the single stitch. Don't ever slip the wrap. If it's diagonal, question what's going on. Brioche knit, yarn to the front, slip. Brioche knit, bark, yarn front, slip. Bark, yarn front, slip. Now, for continental knitters, if you're not a continental knitter, you might want to plug your ears for a second. We're going to knit, brioche knit, we're going to bark, we're going to yarn front but really yarn over, and we're going to slip. That's easier when the yarn's going in that direction. Brioche knit, the slip and its wrap together. Yarn front and over. Slip purlwise. Brioche knit. Yarn front and over. Slip. Brioche knit. Yarn over. Slip. Let's go back to English style. If you like holding the yarn in back with your tension, it's almost the same thing as continental. We'll brioche knit, yarn to the front, but let your hand set to the back like it likes to. It's creating a yarn over, which will wrap this next slip stitch. Slip. Brioche knit, yarn forward. It's actually what the English call a yarn over. It's just a yarn forward. Slip. Brioche knit, yarn forward, slip. Brioche knit, yarn forward. Oop, my brain almost did something else. Slip. Brioche knit. It helps to use the mantra. Yarn forward, slip. Then you don't forget any part of all three. Brioche knit, yarn forward, slip, brioche knit, yarn forward, slip, brioche knit, yarn forward, slip, brioche knit. There goes my yarn. Brioche knit was what I just did. Yarn forward, slip, brioche knit, yarn forward, slip, brioche knit, yarn forward, slip. Don't do anything else. Let it take care of itself. Brioche knit. Whoop, I almost slipped. You got to have your yarn in front before you slip. Brioche knit, yarn forward, slip. Now remember, this mantra has been creating a wrap for every slip stitch by doing the next brioche knit. We're out of brioche knits to do because we're back at the beginning, so we have to create a wrap. If we didn't, take a look back at what it would be. Single stitches in my cream, slip stitches in my teal with cream wraps, single stitch, stitch and wrap, single stitch. There'd just be a single stitch here. We need to create a wrap by going up and over and back to the front, a formal yarn over. And then we could get ready to do our brioche purl row with this color. And that starts in a different way. It's slip, wrap, brioche purl. I am not going to do any more of that because that was last week's. We'll go back and refresh ourselves on both of these next week. But if you do a proper, I did that so my stitch marker wouldn't fall off. If you do a proper brioche knit row, you should be starting to see little V's in color A, and in between you've got stitches and wraps. Stitch of color B and wraps. Stitch, stitch and wrap, stitch, stitch and wrap. You should be able to kind of see that the whole way around. If not, something went wonky, figure it out if you can, contact me if you can't. All right, that was the adventure of the brioche knit row. Next week we'll recap and we'll start talking about what it should look like if everything's going successfully. And perhaps, if it doesn't make the video too crazy long, what you can do if things are going wrong. That might end up being its own video. All right? We're almost to the point where you can start to see the two distinct sides, but you probably have to do a few more rows. If you feel comfortable, go on to do a brioche purl row with color B and then a brioche knit row with color A. You can always wait and see what we're going to talk about next week though. So thank you for coming along for the journey. If you'd like to take virtual lessons or lessons at the shop by appointment with masks, we do offer that for $15 a pop. It's for about an hour. Virtual lessons we could let go to 2 hours. Virtual lessons that we might be able to squeeze in before the new year. Lessons at the shop, we're booked through the first week of January. So I hope you have subscribed. If you haven't, please consider that. Please consider coming to our virtual sit and stitches. We have one this Saturday, which is December 19th. You can join on Facebook Live or on Zoom from 1 to 5. I had to think about that. I'll have details in the description below. We're at the shop Tuesday through Friday, 10 to 5, if you need to call us about stuff. If you haven't subscribed, please do, because that helps everybody out. You'll know when we do new videos, and it helps with our algorithms and crazy things like that. At least give it a thumbs up if you liked it. Suggest new ideas if you'd like. If I can, I'll add them to the list and possibly get to them as soon as possible. I like doing things for both knit and crochet. And on that note, I will let you digest all of that information, and may your crafting be filled with joy and confidence. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye. What do you see out there? Yeah? Where is it? Go get him.